The night was meant to be flawless. In Aurelia, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, the air shimmered with wealth and quiet power. Crystal glasses sparkled under chandeliers imported from Paris. White linen draped across every table like a silent promise of elegance. On this night, all eyes turned toward table 12, tucked into a private alcove with a sweeping view of the New York skyline. There sat Harrison Sterling, the billionaire genius of sterling dynamics, poised to sign a $200 million deal that promised to reshape the world of green energy. His investors leaned in close, eager, their pens ready, their portfolios open. Harrison himself radiated the kind of restless authority that could bend entire markets with a single nod. Everything was in motion: the food, the wine, the whispered agreements, every detail orchestrated for one purpose, a signature that would ignite a future empire. And then she appeared, not as a guest, not as a power broker, but as a shadow gliding between tables. A waitress. Her black uniform was neat but plain, her eyes tired, her steps so practiced that she seemed invisible to the men she served. To them, she was nothing. A servant, a background detail in the theater of their wealth. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. The moment came when Dr. Robert Kendrick, Sterling's head of research, uncapped a pen and began to scrawl an equation across a white linen napkin. His voice carried just enough arrogance to fill the air. He explained in French carefully, each symbol, each line, a performance meant to dazzle, to impress the European investors at the table. The investors nodded politely, their eyes betraying little. To them, it was indecipherable. Numbers, symbols, and promises they didn't truly understand. But to one person in the room, those numbers weren't abstract. They were memories, wounds, ghosts. The waitress, Isabella Rossi, froze mid-step. Her eyes locked on the final line of the formula. Her heart kicked painfully in her chest. She knew that formula. She had lived it, breathed it, built it piece by piece in the lonely hours of her doctoral studies. She also knew the truth buried inside it, the fatal flaw, the miscalculation that could turn promise into catastrophe, and she knew who had stolen it. Her throat tightened, her hand shook against the pitcher she carried. She could say nothing. She was nobody. A waitress correcting a billionaire? She'd be fired before she reached the kitchen. No one would believe her. But then she pictured the consequence of silence, an unstable reactor, a public disaster, lives lost. She imagined the headlines, the smug smile of Kendrick, the destruction of a company, and perhaps much more. Her chest burned. The fire she had buried for 6 years reignited in a single breath. Harrison uncapped his Mont Blanc pen. The contracts lay open before him. The room held its collective breath. That was when she moved. Silent, almost invisible, she glided to his side. To anyone else, it looked as though she was refilling a glass. Her face was calm, her posture humble. But her voice carried a weight that no one could ignore. She leaned close to the billionaire's ear, her lips barely parted, and in perfect, precise French, she whispered 4 words that shattered the night like glass. C'est la mauvaise formule. That's the wrong formula. Harrison's hand froze. The pen trembled in his grasp. His storm-grey eyes snapped toward her, stunned, disbelieving. In a room built on certainty, control, and money, a single whisper from a waitress had just pulled the ground out from beneath a $200 million deal. And in that silence, every life in the room shifted forever. Long before she was a shadow in a black uniform at Aurelia, Isabella Rossi had been something else entirely. A rising star, a girl with fire in her eyes and chalk dust on her fingertips. At Caltech, she was the one professors whispered about, the one who solved equations in margins that others couldn't crack in entire papers. Her world back then smelled not of truffle oil and perfume, but of ozone and burnt coffee in fluorescent-lit labs. Nights bled into mornings as she scribbled formulas across whiteboards, chasing something that could change everything, a catalyst that would make clean hydrogen cheaper than coal. She wasn't just dreaming about science, she was living inside it. Every equation was a heartbeat, every breakthrough a rush of oxygen. But brilliance doesn't protect you from betrayal. She had trusted the wrong man, her advisor, Professor Marcus Albright. He saw in Isabella more than just a student. He saw free labor, untapped genius he could claim as his own. Alongside him was Robert Kendrick, a postdoc who smiled too wide, who carried notebooks filled with her ideas, pretending they were his. Together, they clipped her wings before she could even fly. The fatal mistake came the week before her thesis defense. Isabella had uncovered a flaw in her own formula. Not just a minor error, something catastrophic. Under certain conditions, the reaction wouldn't stabilize. It would collapse, releasing energy violently. A bomb disguised as progress. She reported it. She trusted Albright to help her fix it, to guide her. Instead, he dismissed her as nervous, unstable, just another anxious graduate student, doubting herself. Weeks later, the paper was published under his name, co-authored with Kendrick. Isabella's warnings were erased. Her name was erased. The academic board sided with them. She was 24, drowning in debt. They were tenured, powerful, untouchable. Their lawyers sent letters that made her hands tremble. They threatened to bury her if she fought back. And so she disappeared, from prodigy to nobody, almost overnight. She traded lab coats for aprons, equations for trays of water. At Aurelia, she became what wealthy men never noticed. She learned to move silently, to be everywhere and nowhere. 8 hours a night, she poured wine, refilled glasses, smiled through exhaustion. Customers mispronounced her name, snapped fingers for service, spoke about billions as if they were pennies, and all the while, she carried the weight of a stolen future. There were nights she stood by the restaurant window during her break, watching the Manhattan skyline glow. She'd whisper to herself, "That could have been my world." But then she'd fold the hospital bill for her mother back into her apron pocket and return to her shift. Dreams didn't pay for medication. Dreams didn't keep the lights on. Her colleagues at Aurelia only knew fragments. That she was quiet, that her accent slipped toward Italian when she was tired, that sometimes when a guest ordered in French, she answered too fluently for a waitress. None of them knew that behind her weary eyes was a mind sharper than anyone in the dining room she served. 6 years passed. 6 years of hiding in plain sight, of tucking her brilliance into silence, until the night when the past came crashing back in the form of ink on a napkin. She hadn't expected to see it again. The stolen formula, paraded as triumph. She hadn't expected the ghosts of her old life to walk into Aurelia dressed in Tom Ford suits. But there it was, staring at her in looping script, threatening to turn her private grief into a global disaster. And Isabella realized something. Maybe the world had stolen her future, but it hadn't stolen her truth. And the truth, spoken at the right moment, could still change everything. Harrison Sterling was not born into wealth. That was the first thing people always got wrong about him. He wasn't the heir to an empire or the son of a banking dynasty. He was the boy from Boston who clawed his way up through sheer brilliance and stubbornness, who taught himself calculus at 12 and coded his first algorithm before most kids learned to drive. At MIT, he wasn't just another bright student. He was a comet. Professors whispered his name. By 21, he had designed a prototype energy storage system that won him government contracts. By 25, he was the youngest billionaire on the Forbes list. And by 38, he was no longer just a man. He was a brand, a force, a headline that shaped markets. Sterling Dynamics, his company, was built like an empire of glass and steel. It stretched across continents, employing thousands. The media called him the king of clean tech. He wore the title with a mix of pride and impatience, as if the crown were too small for his head. Harrison lived not for money. He already had more than he could spend. But for disruption. He wanted to bend history. But brilliance carried shadows. The world saw the storm-grey eyes, the tailored Tom Ford suits, the charisma that filled auditoriums. What they didn't see was the gnawing restlessness. Harrison was a man who could never stand still. Every success was just a stepping stone to the next conquest. The $200 million deal at Aurelia was supposed to be that conquest. That night, he sat at the head of table 12 like a king at his throne. Investors flanked him, Mr. Davenport, the silver-haired patriarch of an old banking family, and Kenji Tanaka, sharp-eyed and calculating from Tokyo. They studied him with the reverence of men who knew their fortunes could rise or fall with his decisions. To Harrison, it was routine. Another dinner, another negotiation. He had been in dozens. He thought he knew the script. The investors would sip their wine, nod gravely at the right numbers, and when the contract appeared, they would sign. Because people always signed when Harrison Sterling held the pen. At his side was Dr. Robert Kendrick, head of R&D. Kendrick was loud, smiling too wide, puffed up with borrowed importance. Harrison tolerated him because he produced results, or at least appeared to. Kendrick promised a formula that would revolutionize hydrogen energy. Harrison believed him. After all, that's what Harrison did. He believed in ideas, gambled on them, and turned them into gold. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the sharpest eyes. In the quiet of Aurelia's alcove, Harrison tapped the table with his sleek tablet. "Show them the core equation, Robert," he ordered. His tone was brisk, impatient, the way a man commands rather than asks. Kendrick obeyed with theatrical flair. He uncapped a pen, scrawled the formula across a linen napkin, and explained it in French to impress the European ear at the table. Harrison leaned back, eyes narrow, absorbing every line. He prided himself on understanding, on being the smartest man in the room, even among scientists. But what Harrison couldn't see, not yet, was that the formula wasn't genius. It was theft, wrapped in arrogance, hiding disaster inside elegant symbols. And he didn't notice the waitress frozen beside him, pitcher trembling in her hands. To him, she was invisible, a cog in the background, until she whispered. In that single moment, the king of clean tech, the man who thought he could calculate every risk, discovered there was one variable he hadn't accounted for. A quiet woman with tired eyes who spoke perfect French. And when she leaned close to say, "That's the wrong formula," his emperor, his certainty, and his $200 million deal all began to crack. Aurelia was not just a restaurant. It was a cathedral built to worship wealth. Every detail was designed to remind its guests that they were not ordinary people, but emperors of industry, rulers of invisible kingdoms made of numbers, stocks, and power. The chandeliers were imported from a French chateau, each crystal polished until it looked like frozen starlight. The walls were paneled in mahogany, so dark it drank the light, broken only by shelves lined with bottles of wine older than the waitstaff who carried them. A single glass could cost more than a month's rent in the city outside. For the ordinary people of Manhattan, Aurelia was a myth. You didn't stumble in by accident. Reservations were booked out 6 months in advance, and even then, only if your name meant something in the world of money. The doorman greeted guests not with smiles, but with subtle nods of recognition, because if you had to be asked your name, you didn't belong there. Table 12 was the crown jewel. A semi-private alcove shielded by carved screens of gilded iron, it overlooked the glittering Manhattan skyline. From there, the Empire State Building looked close enough to touch. Every detail whispered exclusivity. The napkins were Egyptian cotton. The silverware was heavy enough to remind you of its worth every time you lifted it. Even the waiters were trained actors in this performance, instructed to glide rather than walk, to vanish when not needed, to appear only when summoned like ghosts bound to service. And into this temple of opulence walked Harrison Sterling and his entourage. The room seemed to tilt toward them, diners pretending not to stare while sneaking glances. Everyone knew who he was. His face had been on magazine covers, his quotes on financial news tickers. He was the kind of man who made even the wealthy feel small. For Isabella Rossi, the waitress assigned to his table, Aurelia was something else entirely. To her, it was a cage made of velvet and gold. She saw the chandeliers not as jewels, but as hours of overtime reflected in crystal. She saw the wine not as luxury, but as a liquid reminder that she could never afford her mother's next hospital bill without smiling at men who saw through her. Yet she moved like she belonged there. 8 hours a night she wove between tables, balancing trays heavy with champagne and foie gras. Her footsteps were silent, her presence deliberately invisible. She had perfected the art of serving without existing, of hearing everything but saying nothing. In Aurelia, invisibility was survival. That night, the atmosphere was thicker than usual. Something about table 12 made the whole staff move with even more precision. The investors at the table, Mr. Davenport with his silver hair and icy eyes, Kenji Tanaka with his measured silence, and a French diplomat's widow rumored to control hidden funds, brought a gravity that was palpable. Their whispers weren't just dinner conversation. They were decisions that could ripple across markets and change lives. Harrison Sterling, sitting at the center, looked perfectly at home. He leaned back in his chair like a king surveying his court, his Tom Ford suit blending seamlessly with the velvet upholstery. To the investors, he was offering the future. To himself, he was seizing it. And for Isabella, standing at the edge of the alcove with her pitcher of water, Aurelia became a battlefield disguised as elegance. The chandeliers sparkled like watchful eyes. The city beyond the glass pulsed with neon, indifferent to the drama unfolding inside. No one knew that beneath the gloss of truffle oil and French wine, disaster was hidden in the ink of a single formula. No one, except the waitress who had once written it herself. And soon, in this palace of polished lies, her whisper would pierce louder than any toast, shattering the illusion of control. The energy in Aurelia's alcove shifted when Dr. Robert Kendrick leaned forward, clutching a pen as if it were a scepter. He was a man who thrived in borrowed light, basking in the reflection of power that wasn't his. His chest puffed out, his grin too wide, his voice just a little too loud for the intimate space. "The efficiency is unprecedented," he declared, his words rolling out like a sermon. "The Sterling Kendrick catalyst," he emphasized his own name, "will reduce the cost of hydrogen electrolysis by 60%. This isn't incremental progress. This is a revolution." The investors leaned closer. Mr. Davenport adjusted his glasses, his shrewd eyes glinting. Kenji Tanaka tilted his head slightly, silent but focused. And the French widow, Madame Fournier, arched a brow, her curiosity piqued. They didn't fully grasp the math, but they understood the stakes. Billions dangled in the air. Harrison Sterling tapped his tablet impatiently. "Show them the core equation, Robert. The part that matters." Kendrick beamed. This was his moment. He grabbed a fresh linen napkin, a small act of sacrilege in Aurelia's temple of perfection, and began to scrawl. His pen danced across the fabric, strokes confident, dramatic. He spoke in French, savoring each phrase, knowing it made him sound refined, intellectual. "Voilà," he finished with a flourish, sliding the napkin to the center of the table. His eyes sparkled with self-satisfaction. "The secret sauce, ladies and gentlemen." The investors peered at it with reverence they didn't quite feel. To them it was an alien language, but Harrison's gaze was fierce, analytical. He studied every line, every symbol, hungry to prove to himself that he understood. And then, at the edges of the alcove, Isabella Rossi froze. She had been invisible all night, a shadow carrying glasses and plates. But the instant her eyes landed on the final term, the world seemed to tilt. Her breath caught in her throat. She remembered the equation not as theory, but as memory. Chalk dust on her hands, late nights in the lab, the thrill of discovery, and the horror. Because she knew what Kendrick didn't say, that the equation was flawed. Catastrophically. Under the wrong conditions, it would collapse, releasing unstable energy. A bomb waiting to happen. Her fingers trembled around the pitcher of water she carried. She wanted to scream, to rip the napkin from the table, to expose the truth right then. But the voices around her drowned her out. "Brilliant," Davenport murmured. "Stable across pressures?" Tanaka asked. "Absolutely," Kendrick lied without hesitation. Sterling nodded curtly, his jaw tight, his pride fueling his belief. "Ironclad," Kendrick pressed, flashing that smug smile, basking in the glow of his own performance. And in that moment, Isabella saw it clearly. This wasn't just arrogance. It was fraud. Kendrick knew enough to bluff, but not enough to understand the danger he carried in his hands. He was gambling with lives, with futures, with the very foundation of Sterling dynamics. The laughter, the clink of glasses, the hum of wealth filled the alcove. But Isabella's world narrowed to a single line on that napkin. A line she had once written herself. A line she had once corrected. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She couldn't stay silent. Not again. Because if she did, the world outside Aurelia, the city glowing beyond the glass, the families who trusted in clean energy, the nameless lives in factories and plants, would pay the price. And so, with the weight of betrayal pressing against her ribs, Isabella Rossi took a breath. The decision formed before she even realized it. She would speak, and when she did, her words would slice through the arrogance at the table sharper than any blade. The napkin with the formula still lay at the center of table 12, its ink barely dry. The investors leaned back in their chairs, weighing promises against risks. Harrison Sterling's pen hovered above the contract portfolio, his storm-gray eyes flicking between numbers and faces. And then, as if summoned by fate, Isabella moved. She stepped forward, pitcher of water in hand, her footsteps silent against the plush carpet. To the world, it was nothing unusual, a waitress performing her duty. But her heart thundered. She leaned ever so slightly toward the billionaire's ear, her lips close enough to brush the edge of his certainty, and in perfect measured French, she whispered, "C'est la mauvaise formule." "That's the wrong formula." For a moment, nothing happened. The world went on clinking glasses and murmuring deals. But at table 12, time fractured. Harrison froze, his pen trembling above the signature line. His head snapped toward her, eyes narrowing like a predator who had just sensed something he couldn't explain. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, dangerous. The investors stirred. Davenport lowered his glasses, Tanaka leaned forward, and Madame Fournier tilted her head, intrigued. Kendrick's smile faltered, confusion flickering across his face before hardening into contempt. Isabella's throat tightened, but she forced the words out again, quieter this time. "The formula, it's wrong." The silence that followed was suffocating. And then Kendrick laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that cut through the air. "This is absurd," he said, shaking his head. "A waitress? Correcting me? Harrison, surely you can't." But Harrison wasn't laughing. His eyes were locked on Isabella, searching, calculating. He had built empires on instinct, and something in her tone, in her unwavering stare, struck him. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't madness. It was certainty. "Explain," he demanded. Kendrick slammed his hand against the table, rattling the silverware. "Explain? She's pouring water, Harrison. She doesn't know a proton from a potato. She's overstepped. This is intolerable." His voice rose, loud enough for nearby diners to glance over. And then the humiliation began. Kendrick sneered at Isabella, his words sharp, each one a knife meant to slice away her dignity. "You think you're clever? You think you understand what took me years of research to perfect? You're nothing. Just a girl in an apron." invisible, replaceable. You don't belong in this conversation, in this room, in this world. The investors shifted uncomfortably, their faces tight with awkwardness. But no one spoke. Isabella stood perfectly still, her pitcher heavy in her trembling hands. Every instinct screamed at her to apologize, to retreat, to vanish back into invisibility. It would be safer, easier. But she didn't. Her dark eyes lifted, meeting Kendrick's with a calm that surprised even her. She didn't fight back, not yet. She didn't shout. She simply absorbed every word, every insult, letting it carve deeper into the moment. Because humiliation has a way of sharpening resolve. Harrison's gaze flicked between them. He saw Kendrick's bluster, Isabella's restraint, and something stirred uneasily in him. For the first time, doubt crept in. Not about her, but about the man he had trusted. The alcove felt smaller, the chandeliers above casting light that burned instead of dazzled. Other diners pretended not to watch, but their curiosity filled the air like static. Kendrick leaned back, smirking, certain he had crushed her spirit. He raised his glass in mock toast. "To the help," he said, voice dripping with disdain. "Always eager to play genius." Laughter rippled faintly around the table, the kind of laughter that bruises more than blows. And still Isabella stood, silent, dignified, a shadow hiding a storm. If Kendrick thought he had silenced her, he was wrong. He had only awakened something buried deep, because humiliation was not the end. It was the beginning. The laughter from table 12 still echoed in Isabella's ears long after she left the alcove. She carried the empty pitcher back toward the service station, her steps steady, her face unreadable. To anyone watching, she looked like any other waitress at Aurelia, efficient, silent, invisible. But inside she was breaking. In the tiny staff corridor behind the glittering dining room, the air was different. It smelled of bleach, sweat, and exhaustion. The chandelier's glow did not reach here. It was the underbelly of opulence, where servers caught their breath before slipping back into their roles. Isabella pressed her back against the wall, her chest rising and falling too fast. Her manager passed by, muttering about table orders, not even noticing the storm behind her eyes. That was the rule here. Emotions were checked at the door. No matter what happened, you smiled. She reached into her apron pocket, fingers brushing against folded paper. Not menus, not orders. Hospital bills. She pulled one out, the creased edges soft from being unfolded too many times. It was dated last week. Her mother's latest treatment, another sum that made her stomach twist. Her mother, Maria Rossi, was the reason Isabella stayed. The reason she swallowed every insult, every snapped finger, every cruel smirk from men like Kendrick. Maria had been a seamstress once, sewing dresses in a small shop in Brooklyn. But illness had stolen her strength, leaving her fragile, her life balanced on the edge of insurance paperwork and overdue payments. Isabella had promised herself that her mother would never know the depths of her sacrifice. Maria thought her daughter had chosen a simple life, waiting tables by choice, hiding the truth of the brilliant career stolen from her. Isabella couldn't bear to add more weight to her mother's frail shoulders. She stared at the numbers on the bill, her throat tightening. The amount due was more than her month's wages. She thought of the tips she had pocketed tonight, folded into her apron. Not even close. Her mind wandered to the past, nights in the lab, chalk smudged on her hands, the thrill of solving an impossible problem. Back then, the future had felt limitless. She had dreamed of discoveries that would save lives, of conferences in Paris, of her name printed on research papers. She had believed in a world where brilliance mattered more than politics, where truth mattered more than power. Now she was pouring water for men who mocked her, who stole what wasn't theirs, who laughed when she dared to speak. The humiliation at table 12 was sharp, but it wasn't new. She had been living with humiliation for 6 years, each day of silence cutting deeper. Tonight just tore the scab off wounds that had never healed. Her hand trembled as she folded the bill and slid it back into her pocket. She wiped her face quickly, not allowing tears to fall. Aurelia was not a place where weakness could be shown. But in the solitude of that corridor, Isabella allowed herself one thought she never said aloud. I can't keep living like this. The walls of Aurelia pressed in on her, velvet and gold, suffocating her like a cage. She wanted out, not just of the restaurant, but of this life of invisibility. And yet she knew escape wasn't simple. Walking away meant walking into debt collectors, into unpaid treatments, into a life even harsher than this one. Still, a spark glowed in her chest, the same spark that had driven her to whisper the truth to Harrison Sterling, no matter the cost. She had risked everything once. Perhaps it was time to risk it again. The rest of the night unfolded like a play Isabella wished she could exit. She returned to table 12 with practiced grace, refilling glasses, delivering plates, clearing dishes, all while avoiding Harrison's storm-grey gaze and Kendrick's smug smirk. The humiliation clung to her like a second skin, invisible but suffocating. Yet someone was watching her differently. Seated quietly at the far end of the table was Julienne Davenport, grandson of the silver-haired banking patriarch. Unlike his grandfather, who exuded authority with every gesture, Julienne was young, late 20s, sharp-suited but restless, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for something more interesting than financial forecasts. And when Isabella spoke French, when she whispered those dangerous words, Julienne noticed. Not just the language, but the precision. The way her tone carried certainty. The way her gaze didn't waver, even as Kendrick tried to bury her beneath insults. Now, as she set a fresh basket of bread on the table, Julienne caught her eye. Just a flicker, but it was enough. A silent acknowledgement. I heard you. Later, when the investors leaned into a heated discussion about risk margins, Julienne leaned back in his chair, watching Isabella glide past. When she returned to the service station, he rose under the pretense of taking a phone call. She nearly bumped into him in the narrow corridor outside the alcove. "Pardon," she murmured, her voice steady but soft. He smiled faintly. "No need to apologize. Your French is impeccable." The words froze her mid-step. She had trained herself to vanish, to be unseen, unnoticed. For someone to bring it up, especially him, set her pulse racing. "You understood?" she asked carefully. Julienne nodded. "I studied at the Sorbonne for a year. Your accent was flawless, not the kind of French you pick up in a phrase book." He tilted his head. "Where did you learn?" Isabella hesitated, the safe answer caught in her throat. She could lie, dismiss it, retreat back into invisibility. But something in his tone, genuine curiosity, not mockery, loosened her guard. "Books," she said finally, her eyes dropping. "And a different life." Julienne studied her for a moment longer. In the dim hallway light, he saw not just a waitress, but the glint of something hidden, something powerful. He lowered his voice. "You weren't wrong, were you? About the formula." Her heart pounded. "I shouldn't have said anything." "But you did." His eyes held hers, steady. "Because you knew it mattered." Isabella swallowed hard. She wanted to deny it, to retreat, but the truth pressed against her ribs like a caged bird. "If they build what he wrote on that napkin, people could get hurt," she whispered. Julienne's expression shifted. Surprise, then respect. "And you knew that instantly, faster than anyone else at that table." The corridor buzzed faintly with the sounds of the restaurant, laughter and clinking glasses echoing through the walls. But here, in this quiet space, Isabella felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. Julienne glanced back toward the alcove. "They think Kendrick is the genius, but I saw his face when you spoke. He wasn't angry because you were wrong. He was angry because you were right." The words struck her like a chord she had forgotten how to play. She looked away quickly, blinking back the heat in her eyes. Julienne didn't press. He simply offered a small, knowing smile before stepping aside. "Be careful," he said softly. "Men like Kendrick don't forgive truth." But some of us, we need it. And just like that, he slipped back into the dining room, blending once more into the world of money and power. Isabella stood alone in the hallway, her heart racing, her mind whirling. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her and seen more than a uniform. And though she didn't know it yet, that subtle bond would become the thread that unraveled everything. The dining room of Aurelia glittered as if nothing had happened. Laughter rose and fell, wine glasses clinked, and deals whispered across velvet tablecloths. But beneath the surface, a shift had occurred. A waitress had spoken where she shouldn't, and the tremor still echoed through the night. Not everyone at table 12 dismissed it. Seated beside Harrison Sterling, just far enough to avoid notice yet close enough to control, was Evelyn Drake, his senior advisor. Evelyn was a woman carved out of marble, tall, elegant, her silver hair pulled tight, her diamond earrings catching the light. She was known in Wall Street circles as the Ice Queen, a strategist whose smile could slice deeper than any knife. And she had seen everything. When Isabella whispered in French, Evelyn's eyes narrowed. She didn't show surprise, didn't gasp or frown. She simply watched, observed, calculated. She had built her career on recognizing threats before they blossomed, and in that moment, she recognized one. A waitress who wasn't supposed to matter, yet had managed to pierce the veil of control around Harrison Sterling. Evelyn didn't care about the formula. It could be right. It could be wrong. What she cared about was influence. And she had just seen Harrison hesitate, if only for a breath, because of a girl in an apron. That was unacceptable. As Kendrick recovered from his public outrage, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her manicured fingers resting lightly on her glass of Bordeaux. She let her gaze drift, as though admiring the chandeliers. In truth, she was studying Isabella across the room, memorizing the details, the tired set of her shoulders, the too quick intelligence in her eyes, the way she carried herself like someone trying to disappear, but incapable of fully dimming her own light. Evelyn had seen women like her before, talented, determined, dangerous in their own quiet way. And every time she had learned the same lesson. Either you controlled them or you destroyed them. Later, as the investors debated margins and Kendrick preened in his false confidence, Evelyn leaned close to Harrison. "She distracted you," she murmured, her voice low, her smile never fading. Harrison's jaw tightened. "She caught my attention. That's all." Evelyn tilted her head, her tone deceptively gentle. "Attention is expensive, Harrison, especially when it's given to someone who doesn't belong at this table." He didn't answer. His eyes flicked toward Isabella briefly, then back to the contract. But Evelyn noticed. She always noticed. When the dinner finally concluded and the guests drifted toward the exit, Evelyn slipped away from the crowd. She walked with deliberate steps through the restaurant's corridors until she found what she was looking for: Isabella, balancing a tray of empty glasses in the staff station. For a long moment, Evelyn simply stood there, watching her. Isabella didn't sense the gaze at first. She was too busy stacking plates, too focused on disappearing into her work. But then she felt it, the weight of eyes colder than steel. She looked up, and her breath caught. Evelyn smiled faintly, though it never reached her eyes. "Interesting French," she said softly, her words a razor wrapped in silk. "Where did you learn it?" Isabella blinked, unsure whether to answer. Just books," Evelyn chuckled, the sound low, almost pitying. "Books don't give you that kind of precision." She took a step closer, her perfume sharp, her presence overwhelming. "Be careful, dear. Curiosity can be dangerous in rooms where you don't belong." With that, she turned and left, her heels clicking like a countdown on marble floors. Isabella stood frozen, her pulse racing. It wasn't just Kendrick who would come after her now. Someone far colder, far sharper had seen her, and Evelyn Drake never noticed threats without acting on them. The second dinner began with the same rituals of wealth. Aurelia's chandeliers sparkled, wine flowed like liquid gold, and laughter rolled across velvet alcoves. Table 12 once again became the center of gravity, where billions dangled in the air like ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. Harrison Sterling sat at the head, more determined than ever. The contract had not been signed the night before. Doubt had crept in, an unwelcome guest at his table. Kendrick reassured him that everything was under control, that one foolish waitress could not derail a $200 million deal. But doubt lingers like smoke, and Harrison hated smoke. He gestured sharply toward Kendrick. "Show them again. This time, clearly, no misunderstandings." Kendrick obeyed, though his jaw tightened. He produced another linen napkin and scrawled the same sequence of symbols, his pen slashing confidently, his voice loud. Again, he spoke in French, his cadence practiced, his tone dripping with superiority. The investors leaned in, their eyes sharp but uncomprehending. They nodded politely, unwilling to reveal that the math meant nothing to them. Kendrick smirked, mistaking their silence for awe. But Isabella was there, refilling glasses, moving silently through the alcove like a shadow. Her chest tightened as her eyes flicked to the napkin. The same error, the same trap, the same dangerous lie. Her hands shook as she set a wine bottle down. She could hear Kendrick's voice booming. "This is the future. Elegant, efficient, unbreakable." Her heart pounded. Unbreakable? She knew better. She knew exactly how easily it could break. And this time, she didn't whisper. She placed the bottle gently on the table, straightened her spine, and spoke. Her voice was clear, steady, impossible to ignore. "In French," she said, switching tongues mid-sentence, "your equation is missing the stabilizing constant. Without it, the reaction collapses." The room froze. Glasses paused mid-air. Forks hovered above plates. Every head turned toward her. Kendrick's eyes went wide, his face blanching before darkening with rage. "Excuse me." Isabella met his gaze without flinching. "You left out the constant. The formula is unstable. Any graduate student would see it." A hush fell over the alcove. Investors glanced at one another, confusion flickering across their faces. Harrison's pen stilled above his tablet, his storm-grey eyes locked on Isabella, searching for cracks in her calm. But there were none. Kendrick slammed his fist onto the table. "This is outrageous! She's staff! She carries plates, not equations. This is an insult to every man of science in this room." Madame Fournier leaned forward, her French accent curling around her words. "And yet, she speaks my language flawlessly. Perhaps we should hear her." Julian Davenport's eyes gleamed with quiet interest. He remembered her whisper, and now he watched her stand tall in the fire. Kendrick's face twisted. "She's making a fool of herself. Harrison, end this." But Harrison didn't move. His gaze stayed locked on Isabella, his instincts warring within him. He had built his empire by recognizing truth in unexpected places, and the conviction in her voice was the same conviction he had once carried himself. Isabella took a breath. "If you build what's written on that napkin, you won't just waste money. You'll endanger lives. And when it fails, when it explodes, it will be your names on the headlines." The silence that followed was deafening. Kendrick sputtered, his arrogance cracking. "She doesn't know what she's talking about. She's nothing." But no one laughed this time. No one sneered. The investor's eyes lingered on Isabella, not Kendrick, and in that charged silence, the balance of power shifted, just enough for the first cracks to show. The air inside Aurelia's alcove had turned electric. Isabella's words still lingered, sharp and undeniable, cutting through the false certainty Kendrick had wrapped around himself. For a moment, silence reigned, a silence thick with the weight of doubt. Then Kendrick exploded. "This is intolerable!" He roared, his fist slamming down onto the linen tablecloth, rattling glasses and scattering breadcrumbs. His face was flushed crimson, his arrogance now twisted into fury. "She dares to challenge me! A nobody! A servant!" Isabella stood still, her eyes steady even as every muscle in her body screamed to retreat. She had spoken the truth, and there was no taking it back. The investors exchanged glances. Davenport adjusted his glasses, his mouth pressed into a thin line. Tanaka remained impassive, but his gaze flicked between Kendrick and Isabella, calculating. Madame Fournier leaned back, her lips curled into a faint smile of curiosity. Harrison Sterling sat rigid at the head of the table, storm-grey eyes locked on Isabella. He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Kendrick saw that silence and panicked. He pushed harder, his voice rising. "Harrison, you cannot let this stand. This Waitress is undermining everything we've built. She's poisoning the room with lies. If you let her stay, you will lose all credibility." He turned on Isabella, his words venomous. "Who put you up to this? Do you think you're clever? You're nothing more than a bitter little girl with delusions of grandeur. You don't belong in science. You don't even belong in this room." His voice carried beyond the alcove now. Other diners turned their heads, curious. The humiliation wasn't private anymore. It was spectacle. Isabella's hands trembled at her sides, but she did not break. She lifted her chin, meeting Kendrick's glare. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "I belong wherever the truth does." Gasps rippled around the table. Even the investors straightened at the audacity of her words. Kendrick sneered. "Truth? What do you know of truth? You're nothing, and I will not allow you to destroy years of work with your nonsense." He spun toward Harrison, desperation creeping into his tone. "Fire her. Now. Show these investors that you have no patience for insubordination." The weight of every eye at the table shifted to Harrison. The billionaire's jaw worked as he studied Isabella. She didn't look away. For a brief second, something flickered in his eyes. A recognition, perhaps, of the courage it took to stand where she did. But then, his voice came cold. "You're dismissed." The words hit harder than Kendrick's insults. Isabella felt them pierce through her chest, but she forced herself to stay upright. Her breath caught, but she didn't allow tears. "Pack your things," Harrison added, his tone final. "You no longer work here." Kendrick leaned back with a satisfied smirk, victory glittering in his eyes. He raised his glass as though the firing were a toast to his power, but the investors' expressions told a different story. Davenport's brow furrowed, Tanaka's lips pressed tight, and Madame Fournier's gaze lingered on Isabella with something almost like respect. The waitress turned ex-employee stood tall, her dignity intact even as her world crumbled. She set her tray gently on the side table, smoothed her apron, and inclined her head toward Harrison. "Very well," she said softly, "but the formula is still wrong." And with that, she walked out of Aurelia's alcove, her back straight, her silence louder than any applause. The investors' eyes followed her until she disappeared, and for the first time, doubt began to creep. Not toward the waitress, but toward the scientist who had demanded her silence. The door to Aurelia's alcove closed behind Isabella with a soft click, but the echo of her words, "The formula is still wrong," lingered like smoke. Inside, Kendrick smirked triumphantly, savoring his victory. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his face carved from stone, while the investors exchanged uneasy glances. But outside, in the dimly lit service corridor, Isabella stood motionless. Her apron felt heavier than ever. The sting of humiliation burned across her skin, but beneath it was something else, a strange calm, the quiet certainty that she had spoken the truth, no matter the cost. She moved toward the staff room, ready to gather her things, when a voice called softly behind her. "Wait." She turned. Julian Davenport stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, his tailored jacket slung casually over one shoulder. Unlike the others at table 12, His eyes held no contempt, no mockery, only curiosity. "You meant what you said," he said quietly, his French accent just faint enough to color the words. Isabella froze. "It doesn't matter. I don't work here anymore." Julien shook his head. "That's not what I asked. I asked if you meant it, about the formula." Her throat tightened. She had risked everything already. What good could come from saying more? And yet his gaze was steady, not prying but open. For the first time all evening, someone wasn't dismissing her. They were listening. "Yes," she whispered. "It's wrong. If they use it as written, it will fail. It could hurt people." Julien exhaled, as if confirming something he already suspected. He leaned against the wall, studying her. "You're not just a waitress. Who are you, really?" The question cut deep. For years, she had hidden behind the role, swallowing her identity along with her pride. But standing here, in the half-light with this stranger, she felt the urge to tell the truth. "I was a doctoral student," she admitted, her voice trembling but firm. "Caltech. Hydrogen research. That equation," her hand clenched at her side, "it was mine, once, before they stole it." Julien's eyes widened. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of revelation. Then, slowly, he nodded. "That explains everything." Isabella's eyes darted away. "Please, forget I said anything. I've already lost too much." But Julien didn't move. His expression sharpened, a quiet resolve forming behind his calm demeanor. "You may have lost your job, but you haven't lost your truth. And truth has a way of finding the light, no matter how many try to bury it." Her breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not since before her world collapsed. Julien straightened, slipping his jacket back on. "They won't believe you inside that room. Not yet. But some of us are watching. Some of us see what Kendrick really is." His lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Don't give up." Isabella swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She wanted to believe him, wanted to cling to the fragile thread of hope in his words. But doubt was a heavy anchor. "Why do you care?" she asked softly. Julien met her eyes. "Because I've spent my whole life in rooms where truth was the last thing anyone valued. Tonight, for the first time, I heard it." With that, he offered her a small nod and stepped back toward the dining room, vanishing once more into the world of money and power. Isabella stood alone in the corridor, heart pounding, mind racing. She had lost her job, her dignity torn in front of the wealthiest men in the city. And yet, for the first time in years, someone had seen her, not as a servant, but as a scientist. The seed of an alliance had been planted, and it would grow into something no one at Table 12 could have predicted. The night air outside Aurelia was cold, biting against Isabella's skin as she stepped into the street. Neon lights flickered across wet pavement, and yellow cabs rushed past in blurs of color. She clutched her apron against her chest as if it could shield her from the weight of humiliation pressing down. Her phone buzzed, a reminder she didn't need. Hospital payment due tomorrow. The digits glared at her like accusations. By the time she reached her apartment in Queens, the adrenaline had drained from her body, leaving only exhaustion. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. She pushed open the peeling door and stepped inside the small, dimly lit space she shared with her mother. "Bella?" A frail voice called from the bedroom. Isabella forced a smile, dropping her apron on the counter. "I'm here, Mama." Maria Rossi lay propped against thin pillows, her frame fragile beneath the worn quilt. Tubes trailed from her nose to a humming oxygen machine by the bed. Her eyes, though tired, lit up when Isabella entered. "You're late tonight," Maria said softly. Isabella sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her mother's hair back from her forehead. "Busy shift, the usual." She didn't mention the humiliation, the firing, the weight of eyes burning into her as Harrison dismissed her. Her mother had enough burdens, but Maria noticed the shadows anyway. "You've been crying." "No," Isabella whispered, too quickly. She turned her face away, pretending to fuss with the quilt. Just tired. Maria's hand found hers, bony fingers curling around her daughter's. You work too hard. I wish you didn't have to. Isabella swallowed, her throat aching. She wanted to scream the truth, that she was supposed to be a scientist, that her name should have been printed in journals, not on restaurant schedules, that tonight she had stood up and told the truth, and it had cost her everything again. Instead, she said, I don't mind, as long as you're okay. The oxygen machine hissed softly, filling the silence. Isabella glanced at the nightstand where unpaid bills sat in a neat pile. Hospital invoices, insurance notices, past due warnings. She had hidden the worst of them, but the numbers haunted her every day. Bella, Maria murmured, her eyes drifting shut. You've always been so strong. Don't forget who you are. The words cut deeper than any insult Kendrick had thrown. Who was she, really? A disgraced student? A thief's victim? A waitress fired in front of billionaires? Her mother slept, the rise and fall of her chest shallow but steady. Isabella sat beside her in the dark, her hand still clasped in Maria's. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, hot against her skin. She pulled her phone from her pocket and stared at the payment reminder again. Her wages from Aurelia had been meager, but they had been something. Now even that was gone. Tomorrow, the hospital would demand money she didn't have. Her mind spiraled. Should she beg Aurelia's manager for another chance? Should she pawn her mother's wedding ring? Should she sell the last pieces of herself she hadn't already given away? The despair was suffocating, but beneath it, faint as a dying ember, a thought flickered. Maybe Julienne was right. Maybe truth had a way of finding the light. She wiped her tears quickly, terrified her mother would wake and see. She couldn't let Maria carry her pain, too. So Isabella sat in the stark, bills stacked against her, her mother breathing weakly beside her. And she whispered into the night what she couldn't say aloud in Aurelia's golden cages. I can't let them win again. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through the thin curtains of the Rossi apartment. Isabella sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, bills scattered across the surface like fallen leaves. The oxygen machine in the bedroom hummed steadily, her mother's lifeline whispering in the silence. She hadn't slept. The humiliation from Aurelia still clung to her skin, every cruel laugh replaying in her mind. Her job was gone. The hospital wanted payment she couldn't make. The world felt like it had slammed every door shut. Then came the knock. Soft, hesitant. Not the pounding of landlords or collectors, but a deliberate rap that carried a strange weight. Isabella frowned, rising slowly. She opened the door to find no one standing there, only a white envelope on the floor. Her heart skipped. She bent down, picked it up, and turned it over in her hands. No return address, just her name written in elegant handwriting. Isabella Rossi. She tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper and a business card. The paper bore only a few words, handwritten in French. Truth deserves a voice. Meet me tonight. Hotel Astoria, Suite 1702, J.D. The business card beneath it read, Julian Davenport, Davenport Global Investments. Isabella's breath caught. Julienne, the young investor who had looked at her differently, who had spoken to her in the hallway, who had believed her when no one else did. Her hands shook as she set the card down. Hope and fear collided in her chest. Was this real? Or another trap? Evelyn Drake's cold warning echoed in her memory. Curiosity can be dangerous in rooms where you don't belong. Still, the note burned in her hands. A chance. A sliver of possibility in a world that had given her nothing but walls. That evening, Isabella stood outside the Astoria Hotel, her heart pounding. The building towered above the city, its gold-lit lobby bustling with suited men and women who belonged to a different world. She didn't. Her dress was plain, her shoes worn. She felt every stare as she crossed the marble floor. At the elevator, she hesitated. She could walk away. She could go back to Queens, back to silence and bills and the slow suffocation of a wasted life. But then she remembered her mother's words. "Don't forget who you are." She pressed the button. Suite 1702 was at the end of a carpeted hallway. She raised her hand to knock, but the door opened before she touched it. Julien stood there, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, as though he had been waiting. "Isabella," he said simply, stepping aside. "Come in." The suite was spacious, overlooking the glittering skyline. On the coffee table lay a spread of documents, charts, and a laptop glowing with simulations. It wasn't a dinner invitation. It was something else entirely. "I heard what you said," Julien began, his tone calm but firm. "About the formula, about the constant. I checked. You were right." Her chest tightened. "You checked?" He nodded. "I had my own team run numbers. If Kendrick's equation is used, it could destabilize under pressure. It's dangerous." He paused, studying her. "But you already knew that. You saw it in a glance." Isabella's throat ached. "I lived it. It was mine once before they stole it." Julien leaned forward, his eyes steady. "Then it's time the right person had a voice again. I want you to help me. Not as a waitress. As a scientist." Her heart pounded. The invitation lay before her, like a door half open. A way back into the world she had lost, but also into danger she couldn't yet imagine. And as she met Julien's gaze, she knew this choice would change everything. The suite at the Astoria had given Isabella a flicker of hope. But hope is fragile in the world of power. For every ally, there is a shadow watching, waiting. And in Sterling dynamics, no shadow loomed larger than Evelyn Drake. She stood in Harrison Sterling's penthouse office the next morning, the Manhattan skyline sprawling like a kingdom below. Harrison paced, his storm-grey eyes clouded with something Evelyn hadn't seen in years. Doubt. "She knew," Harrison muttered, almost to himself. "She saw it instantly. No hesitation, no guesswork. She just knew." Evelyn sipped her espresso, her expression cool. Or she rehearsed. "Don't let a performance rattle you." Harrison turned sharply. "It wasn't a performance. You didn't see her eyes. She wasn't bluffing." For a moment, silence hung between them. Evelyn set her cup down, folding her manicured hands on the desk. "Then that makes her dangerous. Not because she's right or wrong, but because she can make people believe her. You built an empire on control, Harrison, and last night, in front of your investors, she took control from you with one sentence." His jaw tightened. He hated the truth in her words. "So what do you suggest?" he asked. A faint smile curved Evelyn's lips, cold and calculated. "We let her speak again, publicly. But this time, we decide how her story ends." Harrison studied her, the storm in his eyes slowly hardening into resolve. Evelyn always had a way of turning weakness into strategy. That afternoon, the invitations went out. A closed-door investor briefing, scheduled for the following evening at Sterling Tower. The subject, final review of the hydrogen catalyst before contract signing. Kendrick would present, Harrison would preside, and the investors would decide. And Isabella Rossi would be there. The invitation reached her in the form of another envelope, delivered to her apartment. This time, it wasn't Julienne's elegant handwriting, but Sterling's embossed seal. The note was short, impersonal, but impossible to ignore. "Your presence is requested. Sterling Tower, 7 p.m., confidential." Her hands trembled as she read it. Was this a chance to redeem herself? To finally prove in front of everyone that she had spoken the truth? Or was it something else? Julianne urged caution when she told him. Evelyn Drake doesn't invite people she respects. She invites people she wants to control or crush. But Isabella's resolve burned. If I don't go, they win. If I stay silent, the lie stands. Julianne hesitated, then nodded. "Then don't go alone. I'll be there." Meanwhile, in Sterling Tower, Evelyn laid the groundwork. She instructed Kendrick to prepare evidence discrediting Isabella, Fabricated documents, a false academic record that painted her as a failed student who had plagiarized others' work. "She'll try to play the martyr," Evelyn said coolly, standing over Kendrick as he sweated through the details. "But when we reveal her lies, the investors will see her for what she is, and Harrison will emerge stronger than ever, forgiveness without weakness, justice without mercy." Kendrick grinned, the cruelty in his eyes returning. "I'll enjoy watching her squirm." Evelyn didn't smile. She wasn't here for enjoyment. She was here to win. As night fell over Manhattan, Isabella sat at her kitchen table, the invitation heavy in her hands. Her mother slept fitfully in the next room, unaware of the storm about to break. She looked at the embossed seal one last time and whispered to herself, "They think they can bury me. They don't know I've already lived through worse." But outside Sterling Tower, the trap was already set. And when Isabella walked into that room, she wouldn't just be fighting for truth. She'd be walking straight into betrayal. The boardroom of Sterling Tower was a cathedral of glass and power. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the New York skyline, the city glowing beneath as if holding its breath. A long mahogany table stretched across the room, polished so perfectly it reflected the anxious faces gathered around it. Investors sat in a semicircle, Davenport's steel gaze, Tanaka's inscrutable calm, Madame Fournier's sharp curiosity. At the head of the table sat Harrison Sterling, his presence dominating the room, storm-grey eyes fixed on the door. Beside him, Evelyn Drake stood like a sentinel, her poise unshakable. And then the door opened. Isabella stepped in, her plain dress stark against the luxury surrounding her. She clutched her mother's rosary in her pocket, grounding herself. Julianne followed close behind, offering her a nod of reassurance. The investors turned, murmurs rising. Some looked puzzled. Why was a fired waitress here? Others looked intrigued. Harrison raised a hand, silencing the room. "Tonight, we settle doubts. We silence distractions. We prove that Sterling Dynamics is built on truth." His voice was iron. Kendrick rose with a theatrical flourish. He laid papers across the table, sliding them toward the investors. "Before we continue, there is a matter of credibility. This woman," he jabbed a finger at Isabella, "has made outrageous claims about my research. But tonight, the truth about her will be revealed." The investors leaned in. Isabella's heart hammered. Kendrick held up a folder. "Here are her academic records. She never completed her doctorate. She was expelled for plagiarism." He flipped through forged documents, fake reports, falsified committee notes, even a doctored letter stamped with Caltech's seal. Gasps rippled around the table. Davenport's jaw tightened. Fournier's eyes narrowed. "That's not true!" Isabella's voice cracked as she stepped forward. "Those records are falsified. I left because my work was stolen, not because I stole." "Stolen?" Kendrick sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Yes, you stole. Ideas you couldn't understand, concepts beyond your grasp. And now, to mask your failure, you seek attention by slandering real scientists." The investors murmured, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Evelyn's voice slid into the silence, cool and cutting. "We cannot allow credibility to be undermined by fantasy. The stakes are too high. Billions of dollars, millions of lives. Are we to risk all that because a waitress claims to see what trained scientists cannot?" Isabella's chest tightened, fury mixing with despair. She could see the trap snapping shut, each piece falling into place. The investor's eyes wavered. Harrison's gaze was unreadable, stone-like. Julian stepped forward. "This is a setup. These documents are fabricated." Evelyn's smile was razor-thin. "Careful, Mr. Davenport. Are you questioning the integrity of Sterling Dynamics?" Julian didn't flinch. "I'm questioning the integrity of those afraid of the truth." The tension thickened. Isabella's voice trembled, but she forced it louder. "I am not a fraud. I lived that formula. I built it. And I know the danger in it, because it was mine before it was stolen." Kendrick laughed harshly. "A delusion. Nothing more." He spread his arms wide, turning to the investors. "Look at her. A fired waitress, desperate for relevance. Will you trust her, or the company that has delivered innovation for a decade?" The investors hesitated. Doubt crept into their expressions, but so did suspicion. Davenport studied the forged records carefully. Madame Fournier tapped her nails against the table, her sharp eyes never leaving Isabella. And in that suffocating silence, Isabella felt the walls closing in. The trap had been set perfectly. Every word she spoke made her look smaller, weaker, desperate. Her reputation was being burned alive before her very eyes. And yet, somewhere deep inside, she knew this was not the end. Because truth has a way of clawing out of graves, even ones dug by billionaires. The boardroom was suffocating. The skyline glittered beyond the glass walls, but inside Sterling Tower, Isabella's world was crumbling. The forged documents lay spread across the table like damning evidence. Words like expelled and plagiarism glared back at her, lies dressed as truth. Kendrick's smirk widened with every passing second, his victory painted across his face. Evelyn stood poised, silent, but deadly, her icy gaze pinning Isabella to the floor. Her chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. She wanted to scream, to tear the papers apart, to shake the investors and force them to see the truth. But the weight of their eyes crushed her. Some looked doubtful, others pitying. None looked convinced. Her voice broke. "Please, you have to believe me. That formula, it's not just wrong, it's dangerous." Davenport adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. Tanaka's face remained stone, giving nothing away. Madame Fournier leaned back, her lips pursed, sharp eyes studying her like a hawk. No one moved. No one spoke. And in the silence, Isabella felt herself unravel. She saw flashes of everything she had lost. The lab she once called home, her research stolen, her reputation buried, her future stolen by men who wore arrogance like armor. And now, here she was again. Silenced, dismissed, erased. Her knees nearly buckled. Julien reached for her arm, steadying her, but even his presence wasn't enough to hold back the tide of despair. Maybe this was it. Maybe Evelyn was right. Maybe truth didn't matter in rooms like this. Her mother's words echoed faintly in her memory. "Don't forget who you are." But the voice inside her head whispered louder. "You are nothing. You are invisible. You lost once, and you're losing again." Her eyes burned with unshed tears. She lowered her head, ready to surrender, ready to let the storm swallow her. And then, a voice cut through the silence. Low, steady, clear. "I've checked her work." Every head turned. At the far end of the table, Davenport, the elder, not Julien, lifted his gaze from the forged documents. His silver hair gleamed under the boardroom lights, his eyes sharp as steel. For years, he had been the most feared negotiator on Wall Street, a man who could dismantle entire companies with a glance. Now his gaze was fixed on Kendrick. "I took the liberty of sending the equation to one of my independent analysts," Davenport continued, his voice calm but laced with authority. "And it appears Miss Rossi is correct. The formula is unstable. Critically." Shock rippled through the room. Tanaka's eyes narrowed, interest sparking for the first time. Fournier's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Kendrick paled. That's impossible. My work is..." "Your work," Davenport interrupted coldly, "is sloppy. And worse, it's dangerous." He tapped the forged records with one finger. "And if you went to such lengths to discredit this woman, then perhaps it isn't her integrity we should be questioning." The silence that followed was seismic. Isabella lifted her head slowly, disbelief flickering in her eyes. Someone, finally someone, had spoken for her. Her breath caught in her throat, a mixture of relief and fear. Kendrick stammered, his bravado crumbling. "This is outrageous! She's lying! You're being deceived!" But the power in the room had shifted. For the first time, the investors weren't looking at Isabella with skepticism. They were looking at Kendrick with suspicion. And Harrison Sterling, silent until now, studied Isabella with something new in his storm-grey eyes. Not just doubt, not just curiosity, something deeper, recognition. Isabella's heart pounded. The collapse she had feared was not hers. It was beginning to be his. The boardroom had turned into a battlefield. Davenport's revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap, shaking the ground beneath Kendrick's arrogance. The forged records no longer glowed with power. They reeked of desperation. Kendrick's face twisted, panic seeping through cracks in his mask. "This is manipulation. Davenport, you've been deceived. She's deceiving all of you." But no one moved. No one nodded. The investor's silence was worse than open defiance. It was doubt, the one thing Kendrick could not control. Isabella stood at the end of the table, her hands trembling. For years, she had swallowed silence, let others speak over her, bury her, humiliate her. Tonight had been no different. Until now. Her eyes locked on Kendrick. She straightened her spine, shoulders squared, the fire in her chest no longer a flicker, but an inferno. "You stole my work," she said, her voice sharp enough to slice through the room. "And you tried to bury me with lies, but you forgot one thing. I know every line of that formula, because it was born from me." Kendrick's laugh was brittle. "Delusions of grandeur. No one here believes—" Isabella cut him off. She stepped forward, grabbed the linen napkin with the scrawled equation, and held it up for all to see. Her eyes burned into his as she switched tongues, her French flowing clear and sharp. "Sans la constante déstabilisation, tout s'effondre." Without the stabilizing constant, everything collapses. The words reverberated through the room, precise and undeniable. She slammed the napkin down on the table, the ink smearing slightly under her palm. "This line, this one mistake, is why your formula will fail. And you knew it. That's why you tried to silence me. That's why you forged records, spread lies. Because you were terrified someone would see what I saw the second you wrote it." The investors leaned forward, their eyes glued to her. Fournier's lips curved into a small, approving smile. Tanaka scribbled a note on his pad. Even Davenport's silver gaze softened, just slightly, as though acknowledging her courage. Kendrick sputtered, his voice cracking. She's trying to destroy everything we've built." "No," Isabella shot back, her voice steady now, each word landing like a hammer. "You destroyed it the moment you built your empire on theft. I am not here to ruin the truth. I am the truth." The silence that followed was absolute. And then Harrison Sterling rose from his seat. The billionaire's storm-grey eyes swept over Kendrick, then shifted to Isabella. For the first time, the arrogance drained from his expression. What replaced it was something quieter, heavier. Recognition. "Kendrick," he said, his voice low but dangerous. "Leave the room." Kendrick froze. "Harrison, now!" The command cracked like thunder. Security guards at the door stepped forward. Kendrick's protests grew frantic, his voice shrill. "You can't do this! I built this company! I gave you—" "Everything you gave me," Harrison interrupted coldly, "was stolen." The guards moved closer. Kendrick's eyes darted around the room, searching for allies, but found none. He was dragged from the boardroom, his voice echoing down the hall until the doors closed and silence swallowed him whole. Isabella stood rooted in place, her chest heaving, her palms damp with sweat. She had spoken the truth in front of the most powerful people in the city, and for the first time, they had listened. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. One sentence in French had broken the chains of silence, and there was no going back. The boardroom was still humming with the aftershock of Kendrick's removal. The door closed behind him with a final thud, the sound of arrogance collapsing under its own weight. For the first time all night, Isabella allowed herself to breathe. Her hands still trembled, her heart still raced, but her eyes were steady. She had stood against a machine designed to crush her, and she was still standing. The investors exchanged glances, their expressions no longer skeptical but sharpened with interest. Madame Fournier spoke first, her French accent lilting across the room. "I've sat through hundreds of presentations, but never have I seen someone dismantle a lie with such precision. Mademoiselle Rossi, you spoke like a scientist, not a waitress." Isabella's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "Because that's what I am. I was, before they stole it from me. And I will be again." Tanaka leaned forward, his eyes thoughtful. "If what you say is true, then Sterling Dynamics has been risking billions on faulty work. Why should we trust them?" The question hung like a dagger in the air. Harrison Sterling, the king of clean tech, the man whose word could move markets, was silent. He studied Isabella, his storm-grey eyes calculating, searching for weakness, but finding none. Then slowly he rose. His voice carried the weight of authority, but for once there was humility beneath it. "I built my empire on innovation, on recognizing genius wherever I found it, and tonight I ignored it because it didn't come dressed in a lab coat or a tailored suit." He turned, facing Isabella directly. "That was my mistake." Gasps rippled through the room. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her mask of control cracking just slightly. Harrison continued, his gaze unwavering. "You were right, Isabella, about the formula, about Kendrick, about everything. And I would be a fool to let that truth walk out of this room again." The investors murmured, approval flickering across their faces. Davenport leaned back, satisfied. Fournier nodded once, decisive. Tanaka tapped his pen thoughtfully, then set it down. Julien spoke, his voice steady. "Then the path forward is clear. If Sterling Dynamics wants our trust, the project must be rebuilt, and it must be led by the one person who saw the flaw before anyone else. Dr. Isabella Rossi." The title hit her like a shockwave. Dr. Rossi, the name she had lost, the identity stripped from her, now spoken back into existence. Evelyn bristled. "This is unprecedented. You cannot hand a multi-billion-dollar project to—" "Unprecedented?" Davenport's voice cut like steel. "So was Edison. So was Tesla. So was every mind that dared to see what others couldn't. If you want our signatures, Sterling, this is the condition." All eyes turned to Harrison. The king at his throne, now faced with a choice, pride or progress. He hesitated only a moment. Then he nodded once. "Agreed." The decision struck like lightning. The investors straightened, approval shining in their eyes. Julien allowed himself the faintest smile, pride flickering across his face. Isabella stood frozen, the weight of it crashing over her. For 6 years, she had been silenced, erased, humiliated. And now, in the heart of the empire that had destroyed her, she was being handed back her voice. Her throat tightened, tears burning at the edges of her eyes. She drew a steady breath and lifted her chin. "Then let's build it right. This time, for the people, not for greed." The boardroom erupted in applause, and for the first time, Isabella Rossi stood not as a waitress, not as a victim, but as the scientist she had always been. Weeks passed, but the night at Sterling Tower remained etched in memory. Headlines across the world screamed the story, "Whistleblower Waitress exposes billion-dollar lie." Photos of Isabella standing in the boardroom, chin raised, eyes fierce, became a symbol of defiance. For the first time in 6 years, her name appeared not in whispered rumors, but in bold print. Dr. Isabella Rossi. At Sterling Dynamics, the old order had crumbled. Kendrick was under investigation for fraud, his name dragged through the mud he had once thrown at others. Evelyn Drake vanished from the company overnight, her silence as sharp as her schemes had once been. And Harrison Sterling, once untouchable, emerged humbled. He didn't lose his empire, but he lost his illusion of control. And in its place he gained something rarer, respect for the truth he had nearly buried. But the true transformation belonged to Isabella. She no longer wore aprons and carried trays. She stood in labs again, surrounded by whiteboards and data screens, her hands chalk-stained and steady. Investors backed her. Julienne stood at her side, not as a savior, but as a partner who believed in her vision. Together, they began rebuilding the hydrogen project, this time on a foundation of honesty. It wasn't about 200 million anymore. It was about lives, families who would one day power their homes safely, workers who would build plants without fear of collapse, children who would inherit a cleaner, safer world. And every time Isabella sketched a line of the corrected formula, she felt the chains of silence break a little more. But her greatest triumph wasn't in boardrooms or labs. It was in a small apartment in Queens. One evening, she returned home, not in a waitress's uniform, but in a tailored suit, her hair pulled back neatly. She carried groceries in one hand and a small envelope in the other. "Bella?" her mother's voice called from the bedroom. Isabella entered, her smile wide, her eyes bright. Maria sat propped against her pillows, stronger now, color returning to her cheeks. "You're glowing," Maria whispered. "What happened?" Isabella sat beside her, taking her hand. She placed the envelope in her lap. "Open it." Maria's fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper inside. Her eyes widened, filling with tears as she read aloud. "Sterling Dynamics Research Division. Lead scientist, Dr. Isabella Rossi." Her voice broke. She pressed the paper to her chest, sobbing softly. "I knew it. I knew you were meant for more." Isabella's own tears slipped free. She laid her head against her mother's shoulder, the weight of years of pain finally lifting. "I didn't give up, Mama. Not this time." The oxygen machine hummed quietly beside them, no longer a reminder of despair, but of survival. Later that night, Isabella stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. Aurelia's chandeliers, Sterling's towers, all the symbols of power that had once caged her. They no longer owned her. She whispered into the night, in the same language that had once shattered her silence. La vérité gagne toujours. The truth always wins. And in that moment, Isabella Rossi wasn't just a waitress who had stopped a 200 deal. She was a scientist, a daughter, and a woman who had reclaimed her name, her dignity, and her future. The story wasn't about humiliation anymore. It was about justice. And the world would never forget the waitress who spoke in French and changed everything. So our story has come to an end. My dear friends, you're still here with me, aren't you? If you've stayed until this moment, it means something in Isabella's journey has touched your heart, too. Maybe it reminded you of a time when you were overlooked, humiliated, or doubted. And maybe, just like her, you chose not to let that be the end of your story. The Stoics used to say, "The obstacle is the way." What hurts us, what seems like the end, often becomes the path to our true strength. Isabella's humiliation wasn't her downfall, it was her beginning. And isn't that the same for us? Every setback, every betrayal, every silence we've endured can be turned into a fire that lights the road ahead. So if you're carrying wounds, let this story be a reminder. Truth has a way of surviving. Dignity can be stolen, but only if we allow it. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." If this story stirred something in you, please like, share, and subscribe. Because together, we'll keep finding the strength to rise.